Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Welcome back to NPTEL, the National Program on Technology Enhanced Learning. As you are aware, these are a series of video lectures or video virtual classes on the subject cultural studies. We are, as you are aware, in module 4, and we have already looked at some aspects of culture industry and cultural forms, etc. For instance, we looked at the concept culture industry in our first lecture. In our second, we looked at the commodity as the smallest unit of cultural forms. We also looked at media in general in lecture 3, and today we are in lecture 4, which is devoted to television as a cultural form, as a media form. So let's do a recap, as we always do, before we begin to talk about the topic at hand. In the last lecture, we saw that according to Durham and Kellner, media and culture are today of central importance to the maintenance and reproduction of contemporary societies. Okay, so we also saw in the first lecture, for instance, that the culture industry helps in, according to Adorno and Horkheimer, helps in the perpetuation of the of a capitalist ethos. And here also Durham and Kellner, in their introductory essay to the edited volume, Media and Cultural Studies, maintain that media and culture help in both the reproduction of maintenance of contemporary societies. Then we saw that cultural studies and media studies, when they converge, okay, there is, among other things, a reconfiguration of media studies itself by cultural studies, in that cultural studies brings in the semiological or the semiotic angle to culture, to media studies. For instance, there is the semiological criticism, where the politics of the sign in media forms and products are highlighted. Secondly, identity. Then we also found that identity-based media criticism is actually the contribution made from a cultural studies methodology. And of course, media representation is yet another area that has where the inspiration is from cultural studies. Then we also found that mass media studies may be clubbed under 3 separate headings: the politics of popular culture, okay, then an investigation into the structural and historical aspects of mass media, and of hegemony or hegemonic structures that inhere in media forms and practices. Fine. So today's lecture is on television, and really there's so much that has been written on television. There's so much that we could talk about. Okay, in television there are really a myriad aspects that are being researched, and there are where discourses are formed as far as television is concerned. I should say right at the beginning that it is not possible for us to dwell upon or even to touch upon all the aspects, but I hope I can at least bring to you some of the formulations in cultural studies and media studies on television. The key source in this lecture are Chris Barker's the Sage Dictionary of Cultural Studies, Barker's Cultural Studies Theory and Practice, Simon During's Cultural Studies, A Critical Introduction, and Tenny Bennett and John Frau's edited book, The Sage Handbook of Cultural Studies. Fine. So we will first begin with a quotation from Simon During on his from his essay or chapter on television as given in his introductory book on cultural studies. And here is During making this pronouncement on television. Fine, let us read. Television as the dominant medium of the period has a unique relation to cultural studies, which it is clear has been formed around its encounter with TV. Okay? The relation of cultural studies, or of media studies rather, with cultural studies was first, you could say, inspired or motivated by the television. It's not to say that we did not have people talking about other kinds of media like books, for instance, or like theatre, for instance, okay? But with television as a part of mass culture, okay? Cultural studies found that here was really a very fertile area, right? A very, an area that has tremendous scope because it reaches such a large audience, because the representations made there were completely open to both semiological analysis and analyses from the point of view of political economy. Okay, so that is why During rightly says that television as a dominant medium of the period has a unique relation to cultural studies. Okay, and cultural studies has been formed. This unique relation has been formed around, around, as I say, the encounter with television. Further, During says the disciplines turned to populism and devaluation of high culture. Okay, the fact that television was immensely popular and continues to be immensely popular, right? And that audiences from various segments of society could peruse the products of television, whereas high culture products were not available to all segments of the population. Okay, this was another factor why cultural studies found television as a media form an immensely rich area of research. Next, During says its emphasis on cultural reception. It's not only the media text here, okay, it's also, as you'll find later on, the reception of television programs as cultural forms, okay, the cultural reception as a live practice rather than on interpellation or production. This is something that we will unpack a little later when we talk about the audience. Suffice it for us here to simply note the fact that it was not simply as, as we found in Althusser or even in Adorno and Horkheimer's work on culture industry. So it is not that cultural studies found only the interpellating aspects or the seductive aspects of television that to be amenable to cultural analysis, but also found that audience reception, okay, reception of television programs as cultural forms, that there was something much more rich, where there was not simply a one-sided traffic between media television programs and the audience. This was also found to be an area of study that had immense promise. Its sense of, let's read on again, its sense of cultural consumers as segmented all owe much to its contiguity to television and to a TV-centered understanding of the media. Okay, so here this During's words prove that television is at the center of this interaction between cultural studies as a discourse and media as both a discourse and a product. So this really establishes the fact that television is still something that is worth as programs change, as platforms change, as styles change, as so many things change, as studio production costs change. Okay, all these only show that there is still a lot in television, okay, that is full of potential for research. Then During says, of course, in being shaped by television, cultural studies is by no means unique. It is just about impossible to imagine contemporary party politics, sport, music, film, and indeed consumer culture generally outside of their complex interactions with the box. Okay, so such is the importance, such is the power of television, such is the importance of television even as a source of, as we'll see later, source of our identity, source of our pleasure, our entertainment, etc. Okay, so as Simon During says here, cultural studies, it is not that only cultural studies has been affected or impacted a lot by television. He says that even so many aspects of our cultural life and practices, from politics to sport to music, film, you just name it. There is nothing that has not been, as he says here, affected by the complex interactions with the box. Okay, so it is not that, as I say in common parlance, it's definitely, the television is something definitely more than what many call the idiot box. Okay, we have to understand that as consumers of television products, a lot is at stake. Okay, both from the point of view of the television industry and also of us as the consumers. Fine. So, what is the importance of television? If you look at the slide here, the cultural studies finds television a very important part or important form, media form, because it can it can explore this domain, okay, from many perspectives. Now, among all the perspectives, most of the perspectives could be, clubbed under, any one of these areas. First is television programs, for instance, as cultural texts. Okay, you know that cultural studies has a very strong textual element, in the sense that the signs or the signifying practices in as shown by a text, the way texts are encoded, the way we decode text, right? These this forms one of the important perspectives of cultural studies. Therefore, any television program, now be it an NDTV news item, be it reality shows, be it shows like like for instance, at this moment as I speak, programs like Satyamev Jayate, for instance, which have enormous, which is beginning to show enormous power and impact on people, right? These any kind of media text, are even soaps, for instance, are highly what should we say, are highly precious really for a cultural critique, because it says so much about signifying practices, about the signs and codes, particularly of representation. Okay, how is, you could say, how is a particular community represented, how are events represented in television news, okay, how are documentaries made, what do they say about the people who make them, what do they say about the way they are consumed by us. So audience, cultural texts or television texts or programs are really cultural texts that are highly amenable to cultural analysis. Second, of course, growing area of interest, which is audiences, right? You could say is, if you have to draw instead of these five, if you have four, if you have to talk about only two areas, then we would then say that the two, the mega areas under which the cultural studies of television could be divided are A, cultural texts, and B, the audience. Okay, so we will again see later on how audience reception and audience counter creation, okay, audience resistance of ideology as represented through television text. These are things as important as the cultural text programs as texts themselves. Next, it is also a resource for identity. Okay, so television is not a matter simply of text, it is not a matter simply of audience reception. It is a very powerful tool or resource for identity creation. Okay, we looked at the word identity in I think module 2 when we're talking about the key core concepts, okay, in cultural studies. And you also know that we drew a rough difference between a very elementary one, I'm aware, okay, between subjectivity and identity, and we talked about subjectivity roughly as the inner life, okay, what does it mean to be so and so, and we talked about identity as a social label that is given to us, okay. So in as much as we are conscious of our identities, we are conscious of how we are labeled by people, there is always and all the time an interaction with these cultural products, and in that we try to use them as resources for identity creation. Then fourth, it is also definitely a source of popular knowledge. Popular knowledge, for instance, in contradiction to or contradistinction really to academic knowledge or highly specialized knowledge for which you have to receive a training for at least for a particular duration of time. But as far as popular knowledge is concerned, then television programs become, here we could refer to the documentaries, right? Say very high quality documentaries as you see made by the BBC, for instance, or the Discovery Channel or National Geographic, or back home here some of the some of the excellent programs that we see, documentaries we see. These are what? These are sources of popular knowledge, right? And this also has a segment of viewers who are completely devoted, to, so to speak, to these channels. So fine, what is the importance of television in cultural studies? We found that there are 4 areas under which the importance of television to cultural studies may be shown, and these are media programs as cultural texts. And by media programs, as we saw, as cultural texts, we are not only talking about the television serials or things that are for complete entertainment and pleasure, but also things like documentaries and news. We also said that audiences form a very rich area of study as far as cultural analysis of media forms is concerned, and it is also a resource for identity formation and an important source of popular knowledge. So to put it another way, cultural studies and television not only, let's look at this slide please, not only look at textual analysis of text or audience research, they are also about, as far as studying texts are concerned, they are also about the formation of patterns of meaning. Okay, it is not that meanings are always new and always chaotic, right? Keen analyzers of television text will tell you that there are certain patterns because of the form of the medium, of the nature of the medium. There are certain patterns of meaning that emanate, and once we get into these patterns of meanings, okay, they also then very powerfully shape our perception of society, our perception, for instance, of knowledge, our perception of communities, of ethnic groups, of countries, etc., of almost everything that is given to us by television. So patterns of meaning, very powerful patterns of meaning that are created by television forms and programs. Okay, this also forms another important part of cultural studies analysis of television. And finally, of course, something without which nothing really that we talk about holds any meaning, or sometimes many would say even purpose, if you do not look at the political economy of television, right? If you don't see what goes into the production process, if you don't look at what relations of production the television industry is serving, okay, if you do not consider the if you do not consider what goes into the production processes, the distribution processes and consumption processes that go into television programs, then it remains only, all these other things that we do remain only very surface level investigations of television as a media. Okay, so ultimately the political economy analysis is something that we can really never do without. Even if you are making a textual analysis now, as a researcher or as somebody who's doing a project maybe on television, even if you're talking about semiotics, even if you're talking about patterns of meaning that arise, okay, you would then, you'd have a very rich essay or project if you are finally drawing upon the political economy of why such meanings come about in the same place, why such patterns are of meaning and representation are emerging at a given time and space. Okay, only then, that is what even I believe, only then will your investigation from a cultural studies perspective be a total one. Okay, so we find that the study of television in cultural studies through a political economy methodology, through the production, distribution and consumption processes, okay, is something that we cannot do without. Therefore, we may summarize this in another way by saying that the constitutive features then of television as an area of study in cultural studies could be said to be twofold. Okay, one of course is textual, in the sense that every media, television product, every program, as we saw a while ago, every program is really a text. Okay, that we saw is a representation, right? The representation of culture, a representation of knowledge, a representation of meaning. Okay, but on the other hand, as I saw this, as we said, it is not enough for us to simply dwell on the textual, right? The other part is also something that is immensely important. For instance, what are the institutional processes, okay, that enable, this is important, what institutional processes enable such texts in the first place? Okay, what is the mode of production, right? What is the mode of production that gives rise to such institutional forms, which in turn, okay, so to speak, determine, though not in a deterministic way, but determine, as Marx would say, okay, the textual forms, right? So even if you say, like after Marx, that television or the media in general are forms in the superstructure. If you go back to our lecture on Marxism, 2 lectures on Marxism, you recall the difference between base and superstructure, okay, that was pointed, that is really the foundation of foundational concepts of Marxism. You recall that in the superstructure, okay, is where media finds its place. So media is part of the superstructure. But you will also notice that even as media is part of the superstructure, okay, we can really divide it into the more institutional forms, right? Because institutions are also part of the superstructure. For instance, we know that media and education, for instance, the legal system, for instance, are institutions, right, into superstructure. But if you add the cultural studies angle to it, perspective to it, you will find that there is something more than the superstructural institutional elements, and that is in the more rarefied, if I may say, level of meaning creation, of representation, that is of the textual, okay, of semiotics, right? So the constitutive features, as we saw, of television and the study of television by cultural studies fall into 2 broad areas, that is the textual and the institutional. So if you look at television closely as a media form, okay, as a media form, if you look both at the medium aspect of it, okay, and the content of television, okay, this is very important. The television as a medium, okay, what is its nature, and again the content that is there in television, okay, we find that we may talk about it in 4 different areas. That is, one is, it is as a medium, it is in the broadcast form, right? The 4 areas therefore here are the broadcast, the set, the means of distribution, and television as an industry. Okay, so these are, critics have agreed that these are the 4 areas in television studies, or studies of television by cultural studies, where we talk about both the medium and the content. Now, what are the genres? What are the genres, or what are the types, if I may say, what are the types of programs that are shown in television? Very broadly speaking, we may say that the genres fall under news. Now, many would say that even even under news, you may differentiate news programs. Today, if you watch the major channels, you'll find that it is not simply news as we understand it. With the news programs, items are also varied. There are different kinds of news. For instance, you have news devoted, a segment, if not a whole news program, to sport. Then there's of course the weather part of the news item, and there are many, apart from of course the ubiquitous advertisements, there are news programs are also increasingly varied nowadays. Okay, however, we may still call news a major genre of television. Soaps, television serials are another genre, which within that of course you'll have some sub-genres. For instance, as I said in one of the lectures, the Saas Bahu genre of serials, where in India that is a mother-in-law and daughter-in-law relations, based on that relationship. And for instance, there are detective soaps that are detective in nature. Then there are those crime thrillers, right? There are soaps to do with so many other soaps to do with social issues, soaps that very evidently target social issues. So even if there are sub-genres, soaps are again an important genre. Documentaries, as we have just talked about, form an important genre, and of course increasingly reality shows. Reality shows are one could even do a very interesting study on reality shows, and how reality shows are among or with other genres of television are important for subjectivity and for identity formation. Okay, so these are some of the areas that you could also work on in your projects. Fine, till now you will realize that what we have done is we have sort of looked at television and what cultural studies analysis or exploration of television as a cultural form, as a media form, what it has to offer. In particular, we looked at the scope, and we found that the scope is, the scope of cultural studies analysis of television ranges from the study of cultural texts and semiotic analysis of the cultural text and of audience reception. Okay. Also, very importantly, on the political economy. That is, we also found that the constitutive features of cultural studies analysis of television fall under 2 important areas. These are the texts of, the television texts, and second, the very institutions, okay, that allow such, or that determine such texts to be produced, right? So we are again coming back to Simon During, whose text is here an important component of our lecture, and we shall read from During's text, and I shall explain some of the points therein. First, please look at the slide. Traditionally, at least, most cultural studies work on television has concentrated on audience reception, which is a sign of the medium's lack of cultural value. Now, why does During say that this medium has a lack of cultural value? Okay. Now, let's read on. It is as if the programs themselves are not worth taking as seriously as their impact on viewers. So it has been impossible to concentrate on close readings of television text or to construct a TV canon. Now, the point is, we could also add to this by saying that if it is, as During puts it, if it is actually a fact, it's truly a fact, that the content of television was seen, as he says traditionally at least, as lacking in cultural value, as not being amenable to any kind of serious analysis or any kind of serious discourse could not be brought up surrounding television, or there was no TV study of the canon of television. Okay, we could add to this by saying that it was perhaps because there was no cultural studies methodology. Okay, the text will be of cultural value. It says there's a medium's lack of cultural value. Okay, text would be of cultural value, or to put it another way, text would be recognized as having cultural value only if there is a methodology like cultural studies that knows, okay, theoretically that this is, the texts of television are potentially very rich in their analysis. Without text-based criticism, without even a semiotic criticism, okay, these texts were not seen as, by scholars as having enough potential as far as their content was concerned. Let's read on, and I'll quickly read this again. Traditionally, at least, most cultural studies on television has concentrated on audience reception, which is a sign of the medium's lack of cultural value. It is as if the programs themselves are not worth taking as seriously as their impact on viewers. So it has been impossible to concentrate on close readings of TV texts or to construct a TV canon. And partly for that reason, the study of reception has undergone almost constant transformation as it has tried to figure out exactly the value and impact of television. What this means is that one of the ways we can explain this statement is that the very cultural value that television was not seen as having, right, as we saw a while ago, maybe because there was no cultural studies methodology, it came in pretty late, right? Because there was no such methodology, the study of audience and investigation into audience reception of TV programs, okay, within that study, the so-called cultural value of the television text was seen to be accommodated. Let me say this again, okay, if there was no cultural studies methodology earlier, this is traditionally, okay, by which we could talk about the text, only the text, right, it was changes, okay, in the, in audience studies or studies of reception of television, where this very impact and value was, attempted to be understood, okay. In this sense, we have to read During's text. Next, Barker, on the other hand, in his Sage Dictionary of Cultural Studies, has this to say. Now, I'm reading from Barker's text. Cultural studies writers have sought to study television as a socially and culturally informed activity that is centrally concerned with meaning, so that the main focus of interest has been on the interplay between text and audiences. Now, through Barker's words, we realize that there is now no longer the need, or there is now no longer the logic, so to speak, of separating text and audiences, of saying that cultural studies of television does studies television from two sides or two aspects, which is one, A, text, and B, audience. He says that that phase is gone. Once cultural studies, what he calls cultural studies writers or scholars, okay, have begun to look at television as socially and culturally informed activity, then there is not simply a looking at the text and the meaning creation separately, okay, and audience reception separately. He says that the main focus of interest has been between what he calls the interplay between texts and audiences. Here texts are understood to be polysemic, that is, they are carriers of multiple meanings, only some of which are taken up by audiences. Okay, then polysemy, or having many meanings, okay, creation of multi meanings, right. So it is only when you look at the television text in relation to audience reception, and not these two as two discrete methodologies or discrete ways of looking at television, only then you understand that the television text, has many meanings. Now, how it does it have many meanings? It has many meanings because A is what the text itself and the way it has been produced and designed. It sort of gives a particular representation. Okay, but we are no longer in the old school where people used to think that audiences are passive, receivers of text, the way they have been encoded, the way they have been represented, or the way they represent certain issues and certain things, certain aspects of our lives. Okay, the audience itself is also involved in the creation of meaning, and that is why we have a word like polysemy, poly meaning many, many meanings. Okay, and it is once the audience works, and we also find another term, audience work, which will is another aspect of media studies. Okay, they are therefore carriers of multiple meanings. So we find something new being said by at least Barker, pointing to a new phase, okay, of cultural studies analysis of TV, which is, as I said again, the interplay between text and audience and audiences, and the creation of multiple meanings, multiple semiotic systems and representations as audiences begin to work on the meanings being given out by the programs. Therefore, we come to the concept of cultural competencies, okay, and again reading on from Barker, consequently differently constituted audiences will work with different textual meanings. It is immensely important here to acknowledge the fact that a text will have multiple meanings for people belonging to different segments of the audience. One text, you could say a common text, you could say, one common text could be decoded in different ways by people belonging to different communities, different classes, gender, from a gendered point of view. Okay, the common text may be decoded in largely different ways. So consequently, as Barker says, differently constituted audiences will work with different textual meanings. Then audiences are understood to be, look at this term, active creators of meaning in relation to texts, and do so on the basis of previously acquired, this is the term being used here, cultural competencies. What word does a term does it bring to you? Okay, for instance, the term linguistic competencies is an important term in linguistics. Okay, we also found that we can use it as far as we can apply it to Ferdinand de Saussure when he talks about structuralism, that there is a linguistic competency in the speaker. Okay, in the similar manner, this of course this term was given by Chomsky. In a similar manner, we could say that audiences have, by the time they have watched so many programs, so they already have, from a television point of view, from a media text point of view, a certain competency or ability, if you will, a cultural ability, okay, which has been acquired through through repeated consuming of television products. And Barker says here that Audiences are to be understood as active creators of meaning in relation to text, and they do so on the basis of previously acquired cultural competencies forged in the context of, this is important, a language and social relationships. Okay? Media are also very important as far as the forging of the interaction of people are concerned. We do not simply watch a media program ourselves or media item ourselves and stay put. We discuss these things with our friends, with our family. We talk about a certain program. If we like a certain program, we refer it, okay, to our friends. If we do not find a program to be quite conducive to be watched by our children, we ask our children, we have parental control over television programs. Television programs themselves give, these indicators of the appropriate or inappropriateness of viewing by children. Okay, so these are, so therefore the television can also, okay, engender, okay, social relationships. They can contribute to interaction among people, and these are of course forged in the context of language. Next, when we talk about television, it is usually held that there are three approaches. Okay, one is the uses and gratification school, the other is the critical theory school, and the third the encoding decoding school. Okay, the uses and gratification school, it is quite evident, really, it's self-evident, and you look at the phrase uses and gratification, which means that television programs have their uses. Television programs, have the capacity to gratify, to satisfy people. Okay, they satisfy sometimes very deep subjective experiences of people. They give, in fact, they give people, they are a source of deep subjective use, creation of meaning, etc. Okay, so this is one of the ways of looking at television, as use and gratification. The second is the critical theory school. Now, if you talk about the critical theory is a general term, all right, but in the discourse of humanities, in the discourse of literature studies, of cultural studies, okay, of media studies, critical theory is specific in its reference to the Frankfurt School. Okay, our first lecture in this module was devoted to culture industries, to the concept of culture industry, which was given by two very important scholars in the critical theory school, who were Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer. So we know that the critical theory school is a critique, okay, of the culture industry, of its various forms. They are, broadly Marxist in perspective, and they show, how the culture industries try and maintain the characteristics of a capitalist society. Then we have a very important school, which is, which we acknowledge, that is the contribution of the cultural studies scholar Stuart Hall. By now you are familiar with Stuart Hall's name, and this is known as the encoding and decoding school, right? So we'll talk about this later. The early phase, therefore, in 1970s on television and studies on television hinged around terms like ideology, hegemony, cultural power, and also on the routine attitudes and production practices, okay, of the television staff itself, the studio itself, right? So you'll see that largely it was devoted to political economy. The words, the phrase, the sort of concepts were those of, say, Antonio Gramsci, for instance, and Karl Marx, Richard Hoggart, etc. In late 1980s, we had the active audience paradigm, okay, where the focus was on audience as active creators of meaning. Okay, remember the word polysemy, that one text could give several meanings, and in the attempts to create subjectivity and identity construction, audiences were sort of even, they could create and recreate the meanings of the programs. Okay? So, they were not only in that sense active creators of meaning, they were also actively resisting, the so-called ideology that was being kind of supported by television programs, that were being forwarded by the television programs, something that the first phase in the 1970s, that is the ideology school, okay, showed to us. Finally, the phase in the 1990s onwards, research, the focus of research has also included, and now is increasingly including, a global electronic culture. And the questions that are asked are with the high accessibility of television programs, of you to see how many how many channels are now in the offing, okay, by cable television, right. So, global electronic culture and the role of television, and the you would then say the proliferation of meanings that are created, that are available to us, the high segmentation of programs. Not everybody watches all the programs. Okay, so new global electronic culture, which has both which is both diversity and an overarching kind of overarching, if many would say, also many would say, ideological sort of umbrella. Okay? So, the global electronic culture, its different forms, its different political implications, its different meaning creations, its highly variegated, segmented audience. These are the contemporary areas of research as far as the cultural studies of television is concerned. So, Barker then has this to say about this last point, okay, the global electronic culture. Today, cultural studies has a concern with the globalization of television and its role in the creation of a global electronic culture, whereby cultural artifacts and meanings from different, look at this, different historical periods and geographical places can mix together and be juxtaposed to constitute a jumbled up flow of images and ideas. Okay, this is what we just talked about. Okay, it's not that contemporary, there is a variety as far as contemporary television products are concerned. Also, the resurgence of history. Okay, for instance, the History Channel, we have remember there is a History Channel where we can watch so many programs from different eras, historical eras. So, both on a temporal scale of time, that is, and of spatial or of space, right. There is the heterogeneity goes both ways, so from space and from time. So, as he says here, there are, you can also in a very postmodern sort of a way, there is this bricolage or there is a collage kind of a technique. There is a juxtaposition of images, a juxtaposition of text, a juxtaposition of narratives, okay, from different historical epochs, historical times, and also from different geographical areas in the world. So, we have what Barker says, a jumbled up flow of images and ideas. Therefore, what we because of this, what we find are a complex, the semiotic environment or the environment of meaning gets more and more complex, okay, and there are competing signs and meanings. There are more entrants into it, there are more stakeholders in it, and there are more competitors in it, right, because of a global electronic culture. What did we find? We found that the semiotic environment, or the semiosphere, if you will, okay, of television has become more and more complex. Then there are more signs and meanings, and as you saw, even meanings not simply from the programs, also different segmented audiences creating more meanings and contributing to the semantic environment. Okay, there is a distributed network of meaning, there is cultural mixing or hybridity, and as some would say, there is also a cultural imperialism, because even in the hybridity, okay, it does not mean that there is a very happy sort of everyone gets a chance sort of a picture. Okay, there behind this is also the question of who creates the hybridity. So, we therefore have new taste cultures here: ethnicity, age, genre, education, gender, work rhythms, political orientation. This is something what we also saw in the media lecture, so I am not going to go into it. Right. The last point that I would like to make here is the issue of competition, okay, of television with other cultural institutions. Even if it is a fact that television continues to be a very powerful medium, even as when you look at the internet, right, the internet is increasingly available to so many of us, but at the same time television retains its hold. But critics have pointed out that television today is in is in stiff competition with other cultural institutions. So let's look at this slide here. For instance, we saw in one of the first slides that television gives us knowledge also. It's a source of popular knowledge, right? So the competition is among television as a source of knowledge and information, and the education system, the more formalized education system, the academic system, as a source of information and knowledge. Then live sports events as a leisure choice, right? People may not watch it on television, but actually go and watch the live the sporting event, even live. So live sports events also are are in competition with television. The other two are literature, right? If television is, many people say that because of television, children have stopped reading, okay, but scholars also point to the fact that literature, and as far as literature is a source of lifestyle and cultural values, it is not that it is it is not that it is a medium that is not used by people. People still look for cultural values, knowledge about lifestyles and cultural values, to literary texts. And finally, of course, the internet. The internet as a source of information, knowledge and leisure is one of the biggest threats, as it were, biggest competitors, as far as audience, the power of, as far as audience is concerned, as getting the number of audience, the number of people who watch these programs. Okay, so people perhaps are moving more towards to the internet for leisure, for amusement, for entertainment and for knowledge than to the television. So let's look at some of the questions here. Number one is outline the scope of the cultural studies analysis of television. The scope is that we find that within cultural studies analysis of television, these are the four areas: the textual analysis of the television programs. There is a very powerful segment that looks at audience research, okay, and the growing patterns of meaning, and of course political economy, without which we can have no strong foundation or no strong framework for analyzing why we have these texts and audience patterns in the first place. Then, what are the new taste cultures in television audiences? The new taste cultures in television audiences, also in media, on other forms of media, are ethnicity, education, work rhythms, political orientation, gender, age and genre. So I hope I have been able to show you how television as a media form, as an industry, okay, may be looked at from cultural studies point of view. My main goal, or my main purpose in this talk or in this lecture was to show you that, of course, television is an area that is studied in sociology, studied in even ethnographic studies, okay. But my point was to bring to your notice how certain critics like Simon During and Chris Barker, for instance, have tried to say that there is a niche that has been created, okay, when cultural studies methodologies are used to look at television. And to again look at it very quickly, okay, the way a cultural studies scholar is going to focus on the semiotics and meaning generation propensities and potentials of a television text is not going to be looked at by other domains. You know, if you ask a question, we already have a way of looking at television. We already have sociology, we already have ethnography, we have other media studies itself. Okay, so then why do we need cultural studies, separate cultural studies analysis of television? And I hope I've been able to show that, you know, through different ways, that cultural studies also has created, you know, a niche, and the niche is particularly informed by three or four important points, which is cultural texts and the meaning creation of audience and identity formation, particularly, okay, in audiences, then of political economy, or how meanings and you know, how semiotic processes are formed because of particular means of production and modes of production. Okay, so we see that we can have a methodology that is different. This lecture has simply, you know, begun to open up to you the contours of a cultural studies approach to television. There's so much more really. This is just the beginning. Those of you who are interested can go on and look up the texts that have been referred to in this lecture for a better and a richer understanding. Thank you.